Good evening, Susie. It's a privilege to speak to you today. You are an old Stoic and a leading international human rights lawyer, the author of Freedom to Think in Human Rights, Robot Wrongs, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. With over 25 years of experience working on human rights and accountability around the world, your work sits at the vital intersection of law, ethics, and emerging technology. You've advised institutions such as the OSCE and the EU, and have been a powerful voice in the global debate on how AI impacts our fundamental freedoms, especially the right to think freely. I'm really looking forward to learning from your insights today. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, and it's always a pleasure to speak to budding lawyers.
In Freedom to Think, you call freedom of thought an absolute right that must never be interfered with. But in today's digital world, platforms use behavioural data and algorithms to subtly influence what we believe and feel. How should international law evolve to protect our inner freedom from these invisible manipulations? Do we need new legal frameworks specifically for AI?
I think on the first question, when we look at what the right to freedom of thought is, and as I said, it's an absolute right. So what an absolute right means is that if what you're doing would breach that right, then you can't do it for any reason. So it's the same as, for example, the prohibition on torture. If what you're doing would amount to torture, then you can't say, yes, but we're doing it to promote health or we're doing it to protect life. There's no justification ever. And the same goes for the right to freedom of thought. But the big question then is, what is a violation of the right to freedom of thought? What is it that you're not allowed to do? Because obviously we all talk to each other. You know, if you become a lawyer, particularly if you become a barrister, your job will be to persuade people of certain arguments. And that's clearly absolutely legitimate. We do it all the time. We're always engaging with each other, persuading. And the question is, when do you step over a line beyond legitimate persuasion into something that is a violation to the right to freedom of thought? And so there are three planks to the freedom of thought. The first one is the right to keep your thoughts private. So nobody can force you to reveal what you're thinking. And a part of that can also be about inferences about what you're thinking. So people just assuming that they know what's going on inside your head. The second part is the right not to be manipulated, not to have your thoughts manipulated. And the third part is the right not to be punished for your thoughts alone. And that kind of loops back to the first part, because if people are assuming that they know what you think, they might then decide that you're going to be penalized in some way, that you're the wrong kind of person, or that you're going to be punished because of what somebody thinks you're thinking. And I think a classic example, historical example of that, is when people were prosecuted for witchcraft, for example, and they might well have been burned at the stake for what somebody had inferred about what was going on inside their mind, regardless of whether they'd ever thought anything about witchcraft in their lives at all. And so you can see there how you don't have to necessarily correctly read someone's mind for there to be a violation of that right to freedom of thought. But one of the really key questions that you're asking about the current digital age is, where is that line? When does it amount to manipulating someone's thoughts? And so what we do need in the law is to see how judges, how legislators will start to define where those lines are. And it's about, knowing exactly what is legal, what is fine for persuasion. So, for example, advertising. Advertising is designed to persuade people. It's designed to make people change their minds or decide that they're going to go out and buy things. And as I've said, if you become an advocate, it's your job to persuade people. But where it becomes unlawful is when it tips over into manipulation. And there's very little case law so far about that. The only case which talks a bit about it in the European Court of Human Rights is about religion and the difference between preaching, which is sort of part of religious practice, legitimate religious practice, and where in some cases proselytizing goes over that line into brainwashing or using ways to really coerce people and manipulate people. So I think we do need in the law to start seeing where those lines are drawn. So we know that there is a line, we just don't know exactly where it is. And in relation to AI, I think while the general laws apply, the general right to freedom of thought will apply, whether or not you're talking about AI or whether you're talking about people directly interfering with someone's right to freedom of thought. What I think we will see is laws that limit the places that AI can be used or the ways that AI can be used. And so what we might see, for example, is laws that prevent AI being deployed in ways that might be manipulative. So we might see it in emotional AI and the kind of anthropomorphic AI. So where AI seems to be another person, that you feel as though you're talking to another person. Particularly in relation to vulnerable people or children, we might see laws that stop that happening in the future. And those are areas that legislators are looking at around the world.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that. I had a quick question on your time at Stowe. So how did your time at Stowe influence your passion for human rights and your approach to law and ethics?
I have no idea. When I left Stowe, I was going to be a poet. So I don't know, really. I don't have an answer to that. Except, yes, I suppose it pushed me off onto a voyage of discovery, and certainly onto a kind of an international path. I mean, at Stowe, I studied, in the end, at A level, I did art and history of art, history and French, with French literature. And I suppose particularly within history, you see the seeds of that sort of ethical approach. And I remember two things studying for history A level, one of which was the sort of the time around the French Revolution and also the American Revolution, and then also studying Nazi Germany and issues around Nazi Germany. And, both of those historical events have been really important in shaping human rights law as we know it today.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I know we've already touched upon AI, but for the extended project qualification, I'm exploring whether AI should be allowed to adjudicate criminal court cases in the UK. Given your work on the right to think and the ethical use of technology, do you think that there is ever a justifiable case for AI taking on such a role in criminal justice?
My view is no, not when criminal justice goes so much to the heart of people's rights, particularly the right to liberty. The consequences of criminal law are so grave that I think it's really important that we are judged by our peers and that there's human responsibility and human explanation for the reasons why those consequences are decided on.
Thank you very much. And did you ever think that there is a fundamental risk in allowing AI to make legal decisions, particularly in criminal cases where moral judgment and human empathy play such a vital role?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think one of the big questions is how you pick apart what the reasons are for a decision. So AI is already being used in some parts of the world on decisions on probation, for example, or how people are treated in prisons. But when you put all the data into a black box and then you come out, for example, with a risk factor to say, this person is high risk and so they can't be released. If you don't understand why they're high risk, you can't do anything to address the risk. And, they may be high risk because they don't have a fixed address. Well, that's something that then, if you know that's what the reason is, then you can address it and they can then be released and they won't be high risk. So it's very important to be able to understand, particularly in the criminal justice system, exactly why decisions are being made so that people can take steps to mitigate those.
Thank you.
So you've worked with global institutions like OSCE and EU on oversight and accountability. Since AI companies operate globally, but laws vary by country, how can we create consistent ethical standards across borders? What role should international cooperation or new regulatory bodies play in ensuring tech respects human rights worldwide?
It's a really complicated and difficult question, that, and it is possibly, the big question for our age. And I think sometimes we get too caught up in trying to hope that there will be a global standard that will be applied. And at the moment, I think we're at a time of a lot of international upheaval, where I don't think we're likely to see very effective global laws being agreed anytime soon that can then be enforced. So I think it's very important at a domestic level to be prepared to look at what you can do to protect the rights of people within your own jurisdiction, given what you have, or at a regional level as well. And so we can see things like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which has really changed data protection and privacy in Europe, but also beyond. And so we do see some countries and some regional areas creating national laws that have extraterritorial effect, or where they can at least control the way things happen within their own borders. I think it's a really complex area at the moment, but I also believe that if national jurisdictions have the courage to establish the laws that they want for the standards that they want within their borders, and that is then seen to work, then that will work as a template for other countries and regions to adopt. And then maybe at a future point, we will get some global agreement. But I think you need to take action on a national level and not just wait for international agreement.
Thank you. So from a psychological standpoint, how do you think the subtle influence of digital platforms on our emotions and beliefs affect our mental autonomy and identity? Can legal systems realistically keep pace with these invisible but powerful forms of manipulation?
Again, it's a very good question, and it's a big challenge, and it's a challenge that we've seen through the way social media has developed over the last 15 years, and we're now seeing it supercharged with AI and people interacting daily with, particularly with generative AI, and people relying on AI for their friendships, for their relationships, for therapy, all sorts of different uses. And that's very new. It's really only 2 years old that it's been so widely available, and it will have very, very big impacts on our lives. I think one of the really big challenges is not so much necessarily about creating new laws, although, as I said earlier, I think there will be new laws created in certain areas, but it's about how you make sure that people can bring cases where it's appropriate. It's how you ensure access to justice, so that when things go wrong, people are able practically to bring cases to court. And so that, I think, is going to be the really big area where we'll see shifts in domestic and regional and international laws, is about how consumers or how people affected or harmed by technology can realistically challenge those processes and defend their rights.
Thank you. How can governments and regulators stay ahead in addressing the rapid developments of AI while protecting the civil liberties?
I think there's often a narrative that says that you've got to be racing ahead, and that it's all so new that we haven't got anything to deal with it. I think that often, if governments and regulators look at the tools they already have, they'll find that there are many ways that those can be applied. And so you can see, for example, in the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has been looking at consumer rights and deceptive trade practices in relation to new technologies, including AI, and looking at how those apply to what's happening. So I think it's important not to get caught up in the hype that it's all so new that we don't know what to do about it, and actually just take a step back and look, what are the laws that we already have? How do they apply to these new things? Because particularly for human rights law or equality law, you know, they do apply regardless of the technology that's being used. The technology, you know, the law is technology neutral. And so I think that's very important to bear in mind.
Thank you.
Looking to the future, what legal reforms or new frameworks do you think are urgently needed to protect digital age human rights?
I think probably my number one ask would be to look at regulation and limiting the potential for AI that imitates humans. So particularly where it's being targeted at vulnerable people or children. So it would be about saying you can't sell AI as a replacement for human relationships, if you like. So for me, that would be a number one area for urgent regulation, because it's happening very fast and it's affecting people very quickly in ways that we can hardly even predict today.
Thank you. Your work bridges philosophy, law, and technology. How do you see these disciplines working together in the future to maintain justice?
Well, I think technology is something that we have to engage with as lawyers and as philosophers, because it's changing our world so rapidly. But I think technologists also need to be listening to philosophers and lawyers to understand, you know, what the possible futures are with technology. But also, you know, as a lawyer, and particularly as a human rights lawyer, you can often feel like you're raining on people's parade when you're talking about technology. But I always say that thinking about the law, particularly thinking about human rights law in advance, is not about raining on the parade. It's making sure that the parade has the proper organization so it doesn't get washed away in a flash flood. It's to make sure that you are prepared for the worst that could happen so that you can prevent that from happening. And so I think it's really vital that all three aspects take each other into account when they are plotting a way to our future.
Thank you very much for that. Did you have any more questions?
Questions from the audience? Or
Yeah, any questions from the audience? Do you have one? There you go.
Just say thank you, Susie.
Thank you, Susie. I've just got a quick question. Okay. With the rapid development in AI and algorithms, do you think there's any possibility we could see a reintroduction of thought crime with AI having the ability to look at humans and be able to understand how we behave?
I think it's a real danger. I mean, it's completely in violation of the right to freedom of thought. But I think there's a real danger of people suggesting that that is a way forward. And there have been, over the past 10 years or so, various research projects that have claimed to be able to tell whether somebody is likely to be a criminal based on a photograph of their face. And so, yes, I think it is a real danger, and we need to be prepared to push back if that is ever suggested.
Hey Susie, I have a question. Do you have any idea of how you think that AI should be regulated in law in the future?
I think it depends. It often depends on what you're talking about as AI. So I think one of the dangers, again, in these discussions is to say AI needs to be regulated. So we're looking at everything, and that then makes it extremely complicated and cumbersome and difficult to regulate. And so, you know, looking at regulating AI, for example, in a medical sphere, is going to be potentially very different to looking at regulating AI in an advertising and consumer sphere. So I think, for me, one of the key things to think about with regulation is to look at the laws and the sectors that we have now and see if there are any areas that need urgent updating in those fields to address the imminent risk of AI. Because I think if you try and regulate everything that is AI, then you can just get lost in the weeds of trying to work out what that means, and there are far too many different permutations. Whereas if you look at it from a sector perspective, then you can get quite practical ways forward.
Thank you. I've just got one more question. If your interest for human rights law didn't come from Stowe, where did it all stem from? Thank you.
It actually came from a job that I landed up in northern Spain, in the Basque Country, where I'd gone after my degree. I went there to learn French and was teaching English. But I mean, not to learn French, sorry, to learn Spanish, and was teaching English. And once my Spanish was up at a reasonable level, I moved away from teaching and got a job translating for a non-governmental organization called Guernica Gogoratus, which is about Remember Guernica, related to the massacre in Guernica, which was a peace and conflict resolution organization. And I landed up then working for them as a research assistant on conflict, and helping as well with a Northern Irish organisation that was doing comparative research as part of the peace process in Northern Ireland. And so it was that work that really gave me an insight into how law shapes the world that we live in and how it makes such a big difference to societies, particularly human rights law. And so it was that work that provoked me to come back almost not quite 10 years after I'd left Stowe, about 8 years after I'd left Stowe, to come back and study to be a lawyer.
Thank you very much. Last question from me. What advice do you have to young people, especially those interested in law, ethics, or technology, who want a career in advancing human rights in a digital world?
I'd say look for the opportunities to do work that you believe in. I have to say, before my epiphany about human rights law, I'd never considered being a lawyer because I assumed that it would just be really boring. Whereas I've had a really fascinating career and found it really interesting. And there are so many different areas of law where you can make a difference, and so many different areas of law that are incredibly intellectually enriching, but also sort of philosophically that have huge impacts on our society and our futures. And so I'd really just encourage you to stick with what you believe in, but also look for the opportunities to do work that will make you feel fulfilled.
Thank you so much, Susie. It's been a privilege to welcome you. We're so grateful for the insight that you shared today. And thank you again.
My pleasure, and good luck.
Thank
you. Thank you.